Nativism really reached its peak in the early 20th century, and that was in reaction to what would come to be called the Great Wave of immigration. In part two here, we'll see the Great Wave of immigration, the factors that played into the backlash, and then by the end of part two, the victory for nativists, which really changed the country for about 50 years, making it less diverse. Alright, so in some ways for the nativists, this is a battle against diversity. And as we'll see by the 1920s, they think they've won. The Great Wave is the term applied to the 20 million immigrants who entered the United States between 1880 and 1914. That's 20 million immigrants in 35 years. Over that time frame, the average was 600,000 a year. Into an American population that was just climbing over 100 million total. If you look up there decade by decade, you can see that in the first decade of the 20th century, the average was almost 900,000 immigrants a year. Now, when you look at the graph down there, you can see that that's separated out. The blue, sort of light blue line is Northern and Western Europe, and that was the traditional source of most immigrants into the United States. That would include Germans and Irish and British and French. The reddish line is Southern and Eastern Europe. And then the other line is Asian immigration, African and South American. And you'll notice that that line was really much of what we were focused on in part one, right? Asian immigrants. And you see that the total number is actually really small in comparison to the much larger numbers of immigrants coming from Europe. And note in particular here the spike in immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe as this crosses into the 20th century. And note one other thing, how all the lines have these dips in them. So right here, right? Dip. Right here. Dip. Dip. Dip, dip, dip. Dip, 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 dip. That is tied to the economy. So, what's the number one reason immigrants are always coming? It's for jobs. So each of those dips you see in the graph is tied to a collapse in the American economy. So immigrants hear that the U.S. economy is doing terribly, and they don't come. The economy recovers, immigration surges. That's the pattern. Okay, so let's now break apart this 20 million a little bit. And let's take out the four largest groups. 4 million Italians. 4 million Italians. Part of that Southern and Eastern European part you see there. 4 million Italians. 4 million Slavs. That's S-L-A-V. Slavs. Not S-L-O-B, which would be a group of immigrants who, don't take care of themselves. That's what a student wrote on a test once. 4 million Slavs came into the United States. That's not right. S-L-A-V. Slavs. And Slavs are Slavic people who here in the early 20th century had no sort of country of their own. They were a minority ethnic group who lived in countries and kingdoms scattered all across Europe. In all of these, they did not control the governments, and they were, in almost all cases, a minority ethnic group. So they were discriminated against. They were treated terribly, sometimes attacked. Slavs were often fleeing persecution to come to the U.S. Okay, so we have 4 million Italians, 4 million Slavs, and then 2 million Hungarians, and 2 million Jews. Those 2 million Jews came from mostly present-day Russia and Poland. And like the Slavs, but with more intensity, those Jews were fleeing persecution. In parts of present-day Poland and Russia, Jewish communities were often just attacked by mobs in scenes really like more terrifying than the race riots we've talked about in America. Gosh, more terrifying than most of the race riots we've talked about in America. So those 2 million Jewish immigrants are, on the one hand, they're Russian immigrants. They speak Russian. But they're also Jewish immigrants. This dual identity is something that Jews were familiar with, what with not having a country of their own for centuries. So those 4 groups we talked about there, that's 12 million. All right, that's 12 of the 20 million. And notice what the Great Wave did to American society. So down here at the bottom, that's the number of foreign-born people living in the U.S. And then the percentage is foreign-born people, immigrants, as a percentage of the American population. And you'll see that that hovers between 13 and 15% throughout the Great Wave. And to lots and lots of Americans, that was too damn high. Alright, so this map shows you, well, it seems like it shows you where immigrants went to. The darker red an area is, the higher the percentage of immigrants that lived there. And you'll notice the darkest red, so the highest percentage of immigrants, around the Great Lakes up there, parts of North Dakota, Wisconsin, Michigan. So you might think, oh, that's where the greatest numbers of immigrants went. Not true. Because this is measuring the immigrants as a percent of the total population. So up there in North Dakota, yeah, immigrants may be 40% of the population, but that's because there are 10 people and 4 of them are immigrants. Alright, so it's a little bit deceptive in that way. The greatest numbers of immigrants are in the big industrializing cities of the Northeast and the Midwest. New York City, Chicago, Philadelphia, Detroit, St. Louis. Actually, what this map is best at showing you is where immigrants didn't go to, which is the South. Because immigrants are coming for jobs, and the people who want immigrants to come want them to come as an easily exploitable labor source. So, in the South, white Southerners already had an easily exploitable labor source. They didn't need immigrants. There are a few exceptions to this in parts of the South, in a little bit of the cities of the South. People there got upset about immigrants. We'll talk about New Orleans in just a little while.